Hello and welcome to part 2 of the Webcon BPS tutorial. In this video we'll continue fleshing out our gift approval process that we created in part 1. Now it is time to focus on the actual business logic behind the process, so in part 2 we'll cover workflow creation. To follow along with this video you will need a form and some form fields, specifically a floating point number form field. So if you're still unsure about creating forms and form fields in Webcon BPS, please watch the previous video before continuing. Alright, so let's pick up where we left off last time in the Workflow Designer tab of the Workflow Configuration. This is the default workflow that is available for every newly created process. As you can see, it is made up of 2 steps connected by 1 path. The start step is where workflow instances are created. In our case, users will manually register gifts in this step. So let's call it registration. To register the workflow instance, they will be clicking this path button here. So let's call it register. In this setup, registered workflow instances will go directly to the final positive step. But for our scenario, we want there to be an intermediate step where the manager can approve this workflow instance. So let's zoom out a little bit and throw in an intermediate step. This will be our manager approval step, and it will go in between the registration and final step. You can move these elements around by highlighting them and dragging them around the Workflow Designer. So let's make some space here for our manager approval step. So now let's reroute the register path to the manager approval step. You can highlight a path by clicking it, and then you can see the destination point, and you can click it and drag it down over to the new destination step, in this case the manager approval step. Alright, let's straighten this out a little bit. Let's shove this over a little more and drag this up here. To create a completely new path between 2 steps, simply mouse over one of the steps and click and drag one of the red squares and drag it over to the destination step. And when your mouse is over one of the red squares, just release the mouse button. We can call this final positive end step approved. And we'll call the path that leads to it approve. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the difference between an intermediate step and an end step. When a workflow instance arrives from anywhere to an intermediate step, there must always be at least one user assigned to it. For example, they must have a task to complete on that workflow instance. While for end steps, that is no longer the case, so an end step can serve as an archive or a repository for workflow instances that are no longer traveling around the workflow. In other words, there must always be somebody responsible for a workflow instance that is not in an end step. These workflow instances that are traveling around the workflow and have people assigned to them are known as active workflow instances. So with that in mind, let's configure the task assignment for the register path. If you double click on the registration step and go to the paths tab, or to quickly go there, just double click on the register path. It will bring up the configuration window for the registration step, and on the path list you can see all outgoing paths. In this case it is only the register path. In the path configuration, head over to the task creation tab, and down here there are 3 methods of assigning a workflow instance to a user. Predefined will list some options based on the Active Directory. In our case, it would make most sense to select the Assign to Superior option. Since in our scenario, a user will register a workflow instance, they will register a gift for approval, and once they hit the register button, this workflow instance will be assigned to the user that is directly above them in the Active Directory. Always 2 is pretty self-explanatory. I recommend entering yourself into this field because this way you will not have to switch users when you are testing this process in SharePoint, so it's just more convenient that way. And the last option, dynamic, will assign workflow instances to users based on values found in the defined form fields. And hit save process. Before we go over to SharePoint to try out this workflow, let's add a few more things. First of all, it would make sense to add another end step, a negative end step this time, to hold all workflow instances that are rejected by the manager. So let's call this step rejected, and let's draw a path from the manager approval step over down to the rejected step, and also call this path reject. And since this is an end step, there is no need to assign anybody to the workflow instance. Okay, let's go over to the General tab real quick. So two things to do here. First of all, let's give it a nice name like gift approval workflow. And second of all, you will see this table of all the steps. And the idea here is that the order in which they appear on this table will be the same order in which they appear on SharePoint on the left-hand side. So since we want the order of steps to reflect the business logic, let's move up the manager approval step one space up by selecting it and clicking the up arrow over here. And now, since we have some new steps, we also need to configure the visibility of the form fields that we added in the previous video on those steps. So let's go over to the standard form node and over to the fields matrix. So first of all, the visibility of form fields in the manager approval step is pretty straightforward. Since the manager is not required to modify or enter any values, we can make them all read-only. And same in the rejected step, since it will just be an archive step, all the form fields can be read-only as well. Alright, let's save the process. And we are now ready to give this workflow a spin in SharePoint. So to launch a new instance, right-click on your process and go Start Workflow in Process. So first of all, you can see on the left-hand side is the list of steps. They are in the order that we defined on the table in Designer Studio. The order in which these steps appear, it does not impact the actual functioning of the workflow, but having them in a logical order does make it look a lot neater. So I just quickly filled out this form off screen. This is the form that we designed in the previous video. So if you would like to create one that looks just like this, please check out the previous video called Form Creation. Once you're ready, hit register. So first of all, on the left-hand side, you will notice that the workflow instance is now in the manager approval step. The registration step has a tick mark next to it, signifying that it has been successfully completed. And as we defined in the fields matrix, all the form fields on the manager approval step are in read-only mode, so they cannot be edited. In fact, the only thing the manager is supposed to do is click either the approve or the reject button, which will send this workflow instance to the appropriate end step, either the approved end step or the rejected end step. So let's hit approve. And as we can see, the workflow instance is now in the approved end step, and again, all the form fields are in read-only mode. Okay, so back in Designer Studio, a quick recap of what we have right now. A user will register a gift, which will then be sent to their direct superior, who is then tasked with either approving or rejecting this gift. So now let's expand upon this workflow and let's implement the following business logic. Once the manager approves of the gift, the system will check its value. If this value is below, let's say 500 euro, then it will be approved automatically, no problem. But if the total value of the gift exceeds 500 euro, then the workflow instance will have to go through an additional approval step, which will be conducted by the compliance department. Alright, so let's zoom out and let's make some space for the new steps that we'll put into here. So first of all, let's drop in another intermediate step, and we'll call this compliance approval. So now we need a mechanism that will decide which workflow instances go to the compliance approval step and which workflow instances can go directly to the approved step. And so for this, we'll be adding a flow control step, and we'll call this value check. Alright, so let's reconnect this approve path up into the value check step. Alright, let's move this over here. Alright, and from the value check step, the workflow instance can either travel to the compliance approval step, or it can be automatically approved if the value is below 500 euro. So this will be the auto approve path, and this one will be the compliance approval. And the compliance officer in the compliance approval step will have a similar view to the manager. They will see all the form fields in read-only mode, and then they will have access to two paths, one for approving the workflow instance and another for rejecting. We'll call these paths approve and reject. And reject. Alright, so the workflow is ready. Now let's sort out the configuration. So first of all, the workflow instance that arrives in the compliance approval step must have somebody assigned to it. So let's sort out who it is assigned to. So for the purpose of this demonstration, let's imagine that we have a SharePoint group called compliance, which contains all the members of the compliance department. And also for convenience and testing purposes, I am going to add myself as well. Alright, that was the easy part. Now let's sort out the business logic behind the value check step. So we want this flow control step to automatically check the value of the workflow instance, and depending on the value, it will send it either through auto approval or through compliance approval. So double click on your flow control step to bring up its configuration. So we're going to be creating a very basic business rule. You can either create it directly here, or you can click on this icon, 3 dots, up here to open up the advanced editor. So your editor on the right hand side contains 2 tabs. The first one, variables, allows you to obtain various values from the system. For example, we will definitely be using our total value form field in just a moment. And the other tab contains all your operations and functions. Alright, so to build your business rule, you can either drag and drop from the tree onto the main working area, or you can, for example, begin typing. So if I begin typing if, then it will suggest if then, and if I hit enter, it does the same thing as if I dragged it from the right hand side. So in this case, if we go back to the variables tab and drag the total value, and then if total value is greater or equal to, in our case, let's do 500, then the path that this instance will take will be compliance approval. Otherwise, else the path that the workflow instance will take will be auto approve. Alright, this should work. Let's hit OK and save the process. So that was a very basic business rule. In the future, there will be a video covering more advanced examples, either as part of the BPS tutorial series or as a standalone video. But for the purpose of our scenario, the business logic, the workflow is now complete. There is one more thing that we have to do before we go over to SharePoint, and that is, of course, the fields matrix. So our compliance officers will have the same task as the manager. They will either accept or reject the workflow instance. So it's going to be okay if for them all the fields are just going to be in read-only mode. And this is not necessary, this will only be a cosmetic change, but if you go back up to the gift approval workflow node and go to the general tab, you can rearrange the compliance approval to be after the manager approval step. This will again just modify the visibility of the steps on the left hand side. But again, this is just a slight cosmetic change. Alright, so let's hit save and give this workflow one final spin in SharePoint. So I've just quickly filled out this form. For the first example, I've made sure that the value is below 500. So if everything goes as planned, it will skip the compliance approval step once the manager approves of this workflow instance. So let's try. Send it over to the manager approval step, and the manager approves. And the workflow instance, as expected, arrived directly in the approved step. Alright, now let's do a new one, and this time I'm going to make the value above 500 euro. Alright, so I filled out this form. This time the value totals to over 500 euros, so if everything goes as planned, it will arrive in the compliance approval step after the manager approval step. Alright, so let's try. It is now registered, and now the manager can approve. And it arrived in the compliance approval step as expected. And just like in the manager approval step, the compliance officer can either approve or reject. You may also notice that down here, this workflow instance is assigned to multiple people because my compliance SharePoint group just happened to have multiple people in it. Alright, so that's all I wanted to show you in this video. Let's do a quick recap of what we have up until this point. So first of all, from the first video, we have our form, which we can use to enter values and save them in the database. And from this video, we have a complete and working business logic, our workflow. The final cornerstone of our gift approval process of our business application will be a site. This site will be a user dashboard for all our actors of our workflow. So for example, the end users, they need a button for starting a workflow instances. The managers, they need a table compiling all workflow instances that are assigned to them. Similarly, the compliance officers, they need a table that will show all workflow instances currently residing in the compliance approval step or that are assigned to the compliance officer in question. And me and you, the process creators, we need a giant table compiling all workflow instances that have been registered in the system, regardless of which step they are in and regardless of who they are assigned to. And that is what we'll be doing in the next video called Site Creation. So thanks for watching and see you in the next one.
Webcon BPS, the ultimate business management platform.